So back in November, we showed you how we built our mini root cellar using an old broken chest freezer. The whole thing was meant to be an experiment, based on the principles of an actual full-sized root cellar, and our hope was that we could use it to store a good portion of our potato harvest all winter. Well, it's been a few months and a number of you have been asking how it's going, so today I'd like to give you a really quick update. But I'd also like to keep this video fairly short, so I'll be skipping my usual recap. You see, I plan to provide a more detailed update toward the end of the winter, so this is really just some interim results. However, I've still placed a link to the previous video in the description, so if you missed it, I highly recommend you check that out first. Okay, so the short version is that the mini root cellar experiment is going really well. So far, all the potatoes look, feel, and taste pretty much exactly the same as they did 3 months ago. And this is especially impressive when compared to some of our control potatoes. For example, the spuds in the open crate have already begun to sprout an impressive number of lengthy stolons. Those in the burlap sack are doing a bit better, but a couple of them have begun to sprout as well. And while the tubers packed in sand are actually looking pretty good overall, they're no longer as firm as they once were. But to be fair, I think these could easily go for quite a while yet before I start relegating them to the seed potato category. Okay, so it seems as though the mini root cellar experiment is doing a pretty good job, but let's take a look at some of the numbers to find out why. Remember that the ideal storage conditions for potatoes calls for low temperature, high humidity, good airflow, and absolute darkness. Well, throughout the winter, the outside temperature has fluctuated between a high of about plus 10 degrees Celsius and a low of about minus 30. And yet, the temperature inside the root cellar has remained perfectly in the ideal range of about 5 to 10 degrees. But the humidity, on the other hand, has not been quite so positive. For the first week or so, it was looking pretty good, remaining in the high 80s and low 90s, but since then it's dropped pretty quickly, and now seems to have settled between about 40 and 50%. So it would appear as though emulating the dirt floor with the wet sand has proved mostly ineffective. And ironically, I suspect that part of the problem for the humidity is actually due to the success of the ventilation. The passive system seems to be doing a really good job at drawing the cold air in and exhausting the warm air out. And given that it's such a small space, I'm thinking that any humidity increases are quickly lost in the shuffle. But speaking of the ventilation system, I've also added the small fan that I mentioned in the first video, and have been experimenting with it on and off, though so far I haven't decided if it actually makes much of a difference. You see, I've been monitoring the cellar conditions using this indoor-outdoor temperature and humidity gauge. The only problem is that this only reports the current conditions in this moment. But things change quite a bit from day to day and hour to hour, so what I really need is the ability to log temperature and humidity over time. That way I can compare the results from, say, a week of running the fan versus a week of leaving the fan off. Plus, it's also important to remember that this is meant to be as passive of a system as possible. So unlike an energy-intensive and carefully controlled refrigeration unit, we're really just trying to work with natural processes to create the most ideal storage conditions in relation to the conditions within our basement and the outside world. So fluctuations should be considered normal and expected. What's really important when testing the effectiveness of a particular adjustment, like the addition of a fan or adding water to the sand, is that we can look at the conditions inside the cellar before and after the change, alongside the conditions in the basement and the outside. Without having all three data sets, we're leaving out some pretty important variables, and the results will end up being skewed. That's why I've actually decided to remove the indoor-outdoor gauge, and have replaced it with these 3 temperature and humidity data loggers instead. One inside the cellar, one inside the basement, and one outside the house. Now we'll be able to record the conditions throughout the day, even if I'm not around to check them, and determine if the temperature dropped because I turned on the fan or because it was just a particularly cold day. It's unfortunate that I didn't think of this from the beginning, but luckily it's still only February, so we've got a few more months of storage and testing to go. So stay tuned, because I'll have another more scientific results video in the future. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.